The signal came 300 years after Earth burned. It was simple, ancient, in a language most no longer understood, English. Just one phrase repeated over and over again: "We are still here." In the Galactic Coalition archive, this was considered impossible. The last colonies had surrendered or been assimilated by 2450. But this signal hadn't just survived, it was alive. Sent from Quadrant 719, a sector officially marked dead since the evacuation of Vega. We thought we were extinct. That we had lost. That humanity was just a footnote in someone else's history books. But if even one human outpost remains, then they were wrong. All of them. And we have to go back. Even if it means going to war with the coalition itself. Because if we are still here, then who was right all along? Under the cold glare of a dying star, the expeditionary vessel Orion Echo sliced through the void with practiced grace. Sleek and sharp, like a blade forged for silence, it moved past clouds of interstellar debris and forgotten wreckage. The ship, once hailed as a marvel of diplomatic engineering, had long shed the gold trimmings of peace. Now it was gray, reinforced, stripped for survival. Captain Mark Randall stood alone on the observation deck, hands clasped behind his back as he watched the slow swirl of dust against the curvature of a fractured moon. Behind him, the ship's AI silently processed 1 trillion data points per second, scanning for what the Federation insisted was a ghost signal. The message had arrived buried beneath layers of static, smeared across ancient frequencies abandoned before the Exodus Wars. No encryption. No codes. Just one phrase, repeated endlessly: "We are still here." The Federation deemed it an anomaly. A systems hiccup. Randall had read the official dismissal with a sinking weight in his gut. Had seen glitches. This wasn't one of them. The signal came from Sector 719, an expunged quadrant with nothing but redacted records and cold administrative denial. Cartographers called it a null zone. Surveyors didn't even name its dead stars. And yet, the signal pulsed, rhythmic and defiant, from the darkness. The crew of the Orion Echo moved through their routines with quiet efficiency. No questions. Not out loud, at least. They knew better than to challenge a direct jump outside chartered space, even if it reeked of exile. Randall hadn't given them much choice. Had simply altered the ship's coordinates during a maintenance sync, logging the course correction as gravitational recalibration. Only the navigation officer, a pale woman named Sarah with augmented ocular implants, had lingered at his terminal an extra moment, but said nothing. The rest trusted him, or feared him, enough not to press. Days into the black, the ship began to hum differently. The deeper they moved into the sector, the less stable their readings became. Gravitational anomalies flickered like ghosts along the hull's sensory mesh. Lights dimmed without command. Occasionally, fragments of ancient broadcasts, decades old, would claw their way onto auxiliary audio channels. Children's voices. Static music. Emergency beacons that looped and looped until overwritten by silence. The AI reported no malfunctions. Everything was functioning within parameters. Yet the crew felt it. A pressure. Like being watched by something buried beneath the skin of space itself. Randall requested silence on the bridge. No chatter. No speculation. They were to keep course and remain vigilant. He spent most of his hours in his quarters, sifting through the degraded fragments of the signal they'd managed to isolate. Waveforms were jagged and uneven, but unmistakably deliberate. Each pulse matched old Earth's linguistic cadence, English, to be specific. And each time he heard it, a chill crept along his spine, not from fear, but from recognition. Somewhere, against all odds, someone was trying to be found. On the 8th day, they entered the border zone of Sector 719. Navigation instruments faltered for the first time, unable to map the space ahead. The star map bled into static, then blacked out entirely. Visuals held, but the region was empty, void of celestial identifiers. No stars, no moons, no planetary debris. Just vacuum, impossibly clean and dry, as if swept by some titanic force. Randall ordered all systems to manual. The crew moved like shadows, sensing the unspoken gravity of their captain's posture. No lights flickered anymore. No ghost broadcasts. Only the quiet, endless hum of deep space. At 0600 ship time, a proximity alert blared through the silent decks. Something massive drifted in their path, a structure, half buried in the dark, wedged between the folds of gravitational compression. It wasn't visible until they were nearly on top of it. The AI had no record of any installations in this quadrant. The construct was jagged, like a broken limb, with metallic plates twisted at impossible angles. It had no lights, no signals, no functioning core emissions. And yet, from its heart, the message still pulsed: "We are still here." Randall authorized a low-level scan. The results came back fragmented, like the data refused to be read. High-energy fields surged around the structure, residual electromagnetic shells, old defense mechanisms, or perhaps something worse. The exterior showed signs of impact and aging, but no signs of life. No heat signatures, no power grids. Just that relentless beacon. The crew grew uneasy. A mechanic named Ortega muttered about curses. Another, a systems analyst from Europa named Laren, refused to leave the engine bay. Randall felt it too, though he hid it behind the rigidity of command. This wasn't just an artifact. It was a message deliberately left in a place no one was meant to return to. A trap, or a test. Either way, someone wanted them to find it. He ordered a remote drone deployed. The drone's camera fed live footage to the bridge. Interior corridors stretched like ribs through a decaying carcass, walls scorched and warped, floors littered with long-dead terminals. Symbols of the old Terran Accord flickered in the drone spotlight, half erased but still recognizable. This place was human. Not ancient alien. Not rogue AI. Human. Further in, the drone passed through what seemed to be a cryochamber. Shattered glass. Empty pods. And then one pod, in the far end of the chamber, still sealed, still active. Heartbeat readings blinked faintly in the interface. One life. Suspended. The crew watched in silence as the signal cut out. The drone's feed dissolved into static. No cause, no malfunction. Just severed. Randall stood slowly. No orders were given, but the bridge shifted into motion. Suits were prepared. Weapons charged. Helmets locked. This was no longer a scouting mission. It was a retrieval. Or a reckoning. Somewhere, beneath centuries of abandonment and ash, someone was waiting. And Mark Randall, for reasons he had not yet begun to understand, had been the one chosen to answer. The Orion Echo drifted deeper into Sector 719, its hull absorbing the stillness of space like a breath held too long. The void here was unnatural, quiet not just in the way of vacuum but in a deliberate, pressing silence that seemed to suppress even thought. Stars no longer blinked through the viewing screens. There were no planetary silhouettes, no cosmic debris drifting lazily by. Just emptiness, as if something immense had scoured the quadrant clean. The crew worked in hushed, automatic precision. No one questioned the stillness. They had all grown used to the sense of watching and being watched in return. Inside the command deck, instruments began to misbehave. Navigation returned no consistent readings, generating overlapping trajectories and false gravitational signatures. Randall ordered full manual override, stripping the ship of most autonomous control. The Ace voice, usually confident and warm, had grown hesitant in its responses, as though uncertain of the data it processed. Sensor pings bounced back too quickly or not at all, suggesting either massive obstructions nearby or nothing within 1,000 kilometers. The algorithms couldn't decide which was more likely. They moved blind, guided by instinct and fragmented telemetry. Then something solid blinked onto the sensors, only for a moment, just a flicker, but it was enough. Randall ordered deceleration. Through the forward observation bay, a jagged shape began to materialize from the dark, emerging like a fossil from stone. It was massive and broken, an old station or perhaps a fragment of one, anchored between gravitational eddies that distorted visual range. Its design was unmistakably Terran, angular structures, carbon black plating scarred with burn marks and corrosion, antenna arrays warped into skeletal branches. No lights burned from within. No signals emerged. But the station was real, and it was waiting. They maneuvered closer with engines at minimum thrust, maintaining a slow drift to avoid tripping any automated defenses. The crew crowded around auxiliary monitors, watching as the external cameras traced the shattered contours of the structure. Damage patterns indicated external bombardment, likely kinetic. A war had happened here, long ago, and no cleanup crews had ever arrived to document the aftermath. Faint Terran insignia, worn by decades of exposure, clung to the outer plating. This was a military facility, hidden, unsanctioned, unlisted. Ortega deployed a long-range probe to scan the interior. The signal took almost 3 minutes to return, scrambled and incomplete. Internal layout revealed sections that had collapsed entirely. Others remained eerily intact, power lines still threaded through the walls like veins, drawing energy from some source they could not yet identify. One chamber stood out, a spherical node at the center of the station, its shielding layers anomalously thick for its size. The readings showed weak heat signatures inside. Not enough for a functioning habitat. Just enough to suggest machinery still operating. Or something more. Randall ordered a magnetic lock tethered to the station hull. As they latched into place, the ship shuddered slightly, as if in protest. He ignored the sensation and instructed his team to suit up. No one volunteered commentary. They moved with a solemn rhythm, checking weapons and environmental seals, their eyes heavy with apprehension. The docking tunnel extended, pressurized, and hissed open with a slow exhale. Beyond, the access hatch on the derelict station creaked open like the mouth of something too long silent. The airlock was coated in dust and dried coolant residue. Flashlights danced along cracked tiles and ruptured panels. Gravity was absent, and they floated inward with practiced control. Each movement stirred particles that had rested untouched for decades. The corridors ahead were maze-like and disjointed. Walls buckled inward in places, suggesting explosive decompression. Doorways hung open or twisted on their hinges. Some led to shattered laboratories, others to empty quarters where metal bunk frames floated like skeletons. Down one long corridor, they found a command deck, or what remained of one. Glass screens were dark. Consoles had been torn from their mounts. A chair bolted to the floor rotated slowly, nudged by invisible currents. On the far wall, scorched letters spelled out a name half lost to time, LX-7 Outpost. Randall made a note. This was the station that had sent the message. Somehow, its core system still pulsed with enough life to push a signal across centuries. And someone had ensured it stayed hidden. In a sealed wing deeper inside, they encountered a functional door. It stood out immediately, not for any signs of power, but because it lacked the wear and damage that marred the rest of the station. The locking mechanism was analog, a feature phased out long before the fall of Earth's last colonies. Randall forced it open using an emergency crank tool. It resisted, then gave way with a heavy groan. What lay beyond froze the team in place. A chamber, circular and vast, filled with stasis pods. Most were shattered. Glass lay in jagged sheets across the floor. Systems had failed long ago, wiring exposed and dripping residue that floated in slow, syrupy spirals. But 5 pods remained sealed. Their indicators blinked faintly: heartbeat monitors, power levels, oxygen feed. Randall approached one and wiped away layers of grime from the interface. Inside lay a human form, face obscured by frost and time. Hair floated upward in a halo, limbs locked in frozen suspension. The data panel scrolled in low-resolution text: Subject 04. Status: nominal. Cycle: 273 years. No one spoke. The silence became physical. The chamber felt like a tomb and a church in equal measure. A place of ending. A place of preservation. The team spread out, cataloging the remaining pods. Some still held humans. Others, non-human forms, genetically modified, cybernetically enhanced. Experimental types developed in the war's final days, never officially acknowledged. One pod displayed no life signs but pulsed with power. When scanned, it showed only one word in its internal archive: archive. Elsewhere in the station, the long-dead system stirred. Lights flickered in distant halls. Cameras rotated on rusted gimbals. The AI reported unexpected data streams being emitted from the core. Someone or something was aware of their presence now. Randall ordered immediate containment of the chamber. They needed to secure the survivors, analyze the data, and prepare for exfiltration. But even as he gave the command, a low-frequency hum rolled through the floor plating. Doors across the outpost began to seal one by one. Emergency systems hissed back to life. Lights flashed red in warning cycles long obsolete. Back on the ship, alarms triggered. A proximity alert activated. External sensors picked up movement beyond the visual range, a cluster of objects approaching fast. They were not Federation. They bore no insignias. They moved with speed and precision, surrounding the Orion Echo's orbital position in silence. Randall stood at the center of the stasis chamber, staring at the human frozen in Pod 04. He felt the shift, the station awakening, the trap unfolding. The message had not been a call for help. It had been a lure. Or maybe a test. Either way, they had answered it, and now the past had begun to remember itself. The interior of the derelict station exhaled stale air and silence, breathing out dust disturbed by boots that had no right walking its forgotten halls. The away team drifted cautiously down the central corridor, their suits gliding through zero gravity with disciplined control, flashlights tracing beams across peeling walls and corroded pipes. Somewhere deeper in the station, power flickered to life in isolated pulses, like a heart struggling to remember how to beat. Panels blinked with soft red warnings, and conduits hissed weakly with pressure regulation. Though most of the station was dead, something in its core had begun to stir. The structure groaned in places, metal expanding and contracting as if protesting the intrusion. The lights they passed began to warm and glow dimly, not fully operational but responding to presence. Proximity-activated systems, buried in outdated programming, woke from centuries of standby. A strip of emergency lighting flickered on behind the team a moment after they passed, illuminating their path backward rather than forward. They didn't notice at first, there was too much to take in. Ceiling panels were missing, exposing skeletal infrastructure. Wires dangled like veins, some snapped and trailing sparks, others coiled tightly around beams like they had grown that way. They moved through an antechamber where the floor had partially collapsed. Below them, a vast storage bay yawned open, filled with disused maintenance drones and broken machinery. Ladders were twisted and unusable, and most of the catwalks had detached. A dense film of rust coated everything, giving the entire chamber a blood-stained hue. Through the flickering light, outlines of old banners could be seen clinging to the walls, symbols of a pre-collapse Terran military division. The fabric had long since deteriorated, but parts of the insignias remained: stylized wings, stars, a shield divided by a single vertical line. Whatever unit this outpost had belonged to, it had been wiped from official records, its designation unknown even to the onboard AI. That, in itself, was a kind of answer. Down another corridor, automated doors twitched in half-functional spasms, some opening halfway and remaining stuck, others fluttering open and shut like nervous eyelids. The group passed through a series of crew quarters, their contents still in place as if the inhabitants had left only minutes ago. Beds floated from their moorings. Personal effects drifted in slow arcs, old identification badges, tablets with dead screens, even a child's toy clutched in a skeletal hand. No damage, no signs of violence. Just abandonment. Still, the rooms felt wrong. The silence pressed in with more weight than vacuum should have allowed. It was not the quiet of emptiness but of suppression, as if something wanted every sound devoured the moment it was made. As they approached the station's central data hub, the corridor grew narrower and darker. Here, the walls had been reinforced with plating not standard for a scientific outpost. Magnetic shielding protruded in odd shapes from the ceiling. Access panels were triple-locked, and the doors required both manual override and biometric confirmation. The systems were old, but operational enough to yield under Randall's clearance hacks and the ACE assistance. When the final door slid open, a wave of colder air spilled out, and a faint, high-frequency hum began to resonate through their helmets. The data hub was circular, with a domed ceiling and floor-mounted access pillars. Most screens were shattered or coated in dark organic mold that shimmered when disturbed by light. However, one screen near the far wall flickered and blinked erratically. Lines of code began scrolling upward, seemingly random at first, but then organizing into recognizable commands. Language matrices snapped into place. File headers appeared. Internal sensors from the Orion Echo fed the information directly into the ship's translation core. The files were old mission logs, entries from officers assigned to the outpost over 2 centuries ago. Most were corrupted beyond use, but a few were intact enough to read. The logs described irregularities in deep space telemetry, anomalies in quantum entanglement fields, and personnel unease. Then, abruptly, a shift. The entries became shorter, more paranoid, written at odd intervals. Mentions of the signal beneath the core increased, along with requests for extraction that went unanswered. The final entry simply read, "They told us this was a monitoring station." It isn't. Nothing we send out ever really leaves. After that, nothing. Randall instructed the AI to begin copying the logs for analysis. As the data transfer began, the lights in the chamber dimmed and then brightened again. More systems activated, by design or proximity, it was impossible to tell. Doors across the station registered as locked down. From the ship, command signals attempting to reopen them met with systemic resistance. The outpost had taken back control from its new guests. Whatever dormant intelligence still pulsed in its core now recognized them as intruders. They pressed deeper into the hub, discovering a stairwell that led down toward the structure's gravity control center. With emergency magnetic boots engaged, they descended into darkness illuminated only by helmet lights and faint wall panels that blinked like dying embers. The air here felt denser, like the station was breathing them in. Every footfall seemed to echo in ways that didn't match the space. Sound stretched and twisted slightly, distorted like they were passing through layers of something unseen. The walls bore deep scratches, long gouges that curved upward as though something had been dragged or had tried to climb. Below, the control chamber opened into a hexagonal space wrapped in coolant pipes and reactor feed lines. And at its center was the core, not the main energy unit, but a secondary one built directly beneath the central node. It pulsed not with light but with gravity distortion, a low hum that pressed inward from all directions. There were no buttons or terminals, just a single black obelisk suspended in midair by magnetic anchors. It spun slowly, almost imperceptibly, and emitted a frequency that didn't register on any known spectrum. Beneath it, a platform held 6 cables that extended toward sealed conduits, one for each of the remaining cryopods they had found earlier. The obelisk surface shifted with minute carvings that glimmered in response to the team's proximity. They were not written in Terran language, nor any known alien dialect. They were reactive, rearranging themselves in subtle patterns, as if the obelisk was trying to communicate. The AI recorded and analyzed the symbols in real time, but every decryption attempt failed. Eventually, it stopped trying. Not due to system limitations, but because something in the station's network had begun rewriting the data the moment it was saved. The away team stepped back. The lights dimmed further, then died completely, leaving only suit lamps and emergency flashes. From somewhere deep in the station, a new sound emerged, a long, drawn-out groan of metal under pressure, followed by rhythmic thuds like footsteps several decks above. The crew exchanged glances without speaking. The thudding grew louder, then stopped. Silence again. Then, softly, a new message scrolled across the helmet HUDs of every member on the away team. It wasn't transmitted by the AI. The source was local, but untraceable. The message read, "You are not the first. You will not be the last." The floor beneath the obelisk began to ripple, not physically, but visually, as though space itself was bending in slow waves. A field of distortion spread outward in a perfect circle, distorting time signatures in nearby instruments. Suits recorded discrepancies in motion, temperature, and local gravity. One crew member attempted to log the phenomenon but found their inputs rearranged seconds after they typed. The station was asserting influence. It had grown used to solitude, and now it was deciding what to reveal, and what to keep. Randall made the decision to pull the team back. Whatever was powering the outpost was far older than the architecture implied. Whether it was human technology twisted by time or something else entirely, it was no longer inert. They would return to the cryo chamber. The lives suspended their needed answers. The obelisk had shown them a glimpse of what lay beneath the surface of this forgotten relic, but deeper questions remained. Why had the message been sent? Who or what had remained behind to transmit it across centuries? And most of all, had the station truly been asleep before they arrived? As they ascended the stairwell, the humming from below followed them like a whisper, retreating only when the chamber door sealed shut behind them. The outpost had begun to breathe again, and each breath carried with it memories of war, of isolation, and of things buried far too deep for history to remember. The crew of the Orion Echo had found something that was never meant to be discovered. And the outpost, no longer content with silence, was remembering how to speak. Dust drifted in slow spirals as the team moved deeper into the lower levels of the outpost, every footstep echoed by the metallic groan of a structure that had long since forgotten the touch of the living. The air grew colder, thinner, as if the station resisted their presence, pulling oxygen into the walls to deny them breath. Light from the helmets flickered, bouncing off corroded surfaces and tangled wires that formed a kind of artificial undergrowth, abandoned, yet unnervingly organic in its sprawl. The gravity stabilizers in this section had degraded beyond functionality, forcing them to rely on magnetic boots that clicked softly with each step. With every corridor they passed, the sense of compression grew stronger. The walls no longer felt like dead steel. They felt aware. They reached a maintenance shaft sealed behind a rusted bulkhead that had been overridden from the inside, not the outside. That detail hung heavy in Randall's thoughts as he forced the panel open. The shaft descended into darkness so complete that even the helmet light struggled to illuminate more than a few meters ahead. The walls here were different, less industrial, more refined, with remnants of plating that bore designs unlike anything in the Federation's archives. Hexagonal patterns pulsed beneath the grime, like circuitry carved directly into the surface of the station. It wasn't just old. It was layered, new architecture built atop older foundations. This was no simple outpost, it was a structure retrofitted over something else, something buried. As they descended the shaft, ambient temperature dropped further. Their suits compensated, but the chill still seeped through. At the bottom lay a vault door, perfectly circular, with no handle or panel. It was simply embedded into the wall, featureless except for a thin ring of copper-like metal inset around the edge. When Randall approached, the ring reacted, lines etched into the copper began to glow, and the door split open with a whisper, folding in on itself like a camera iris. The chamber beyond was vast and silent, cylindrical in shape and lined with cables and anchor points that had once held heavy equipment, now long removed. This was a service core, but not one designed for power distribution or propulsion. This had been used to stabilize something. And that something was still here. In the center of the chamber, suspended by an array of thin, humming field emitters, hovered a black sphere roughly the size of a shuttle cockpit. It didn't spin, didn't pulse, didn't move in any conventional way, but its presence dominated the room. It absorbed light rather than reflected it. When beams touched its surface, they vanished. Instruments registered it as a vacuum anomaly, as though it existed in a space fractionally out of sync with the rest of the universe. It emitted no radiation, no heat, and yet the atmosphere surrounding it was warm, slightly humid, like a greenhouse left untended. Patterns shimmered faintly across its surface, like constellations, but wrong, impossibly detailed and shifting too quickly for the eye to follow. Beneath the sphere was a recessed platform, and within that, another stasis pod, older than the others, heavily shielded and half-fused with the floor. It bore no identifiers, no markings, just a single biometric lock that blinked in standby. The pod was still active. Inside, barely visible through a mist of condensation and internal frost, was not a person, but a shape. Limbs curled too tightly to be human. Spine arched in an unnatural arc. Skin pale with a bluish tint that glowed under the filtered lights of their suits. Whatever lay inside had been modified or created for a purpose far beyond survival. It had been preserved. Contained. Not as a relic, but as a failsafe. Around the chamber walls were consoles, manual terminals, not linked to the station's AI, some still partially functional. As they activated them, screens lit up with files bearing encrypted symbols. The AI began to decipher them slowly, translating a hidden layer of code buried deep within the station's substructure. What emerged wasn't a log, or a report, but a confession. A fragmented record written by the last lead scientist stationed there over 200 years ago, whose identity had been wiped from Federation history. The messages described the station's true origin. LX-7 hadn't been built for research or defense, it had been a containment site. The Federation, in its final decade before collapse, had encountered something during their expansion into uncharted space, an object adrift beyond the Orion Veil, emitting a signal not in radio waves or pulses, but through gravimetric distortion. Ships that passed near it experienced malfunctions, crew reported hallucinations, and eventually, a mining vessel disappeared entirely, its final transmission corrupted into indecipherable screeching patterns that no one could explain. The object was recovered, brought back under quarantine, and hidden away in a classified project. LX-7 was created around it to monitor and understand it. The crew stationed there were sworn to secrecy, their existence erased from records, their mission recoded as a defunct listening post. But the object resisted study. Its internal structure was unreadable, its mass fluctuated inconsistently, and prolonged proximity to it resulted in cognitive deterioration. The last entries in the logs grew erratic. The scientist began speaking of dreams shared among crew, of thoughts that weren't their own seeping into their minds. He mentioned the object reacting to emotional states, growing more active when fear or despair was present. Crew began disappearing within the station. Some were later found inside closed rooms with no memory of how they got there. Others were never found at all. The stasis pod beneath the sphere was the last desperate act, a containment effort, but not of the object. Of someone who had merged with it. A crew member, or something that had once been one. The log stopped abruptly, mid-entry, as if the writer had been interrupted. The AI confirmed that the sphere's distortion field had recently weakened, likely due to their proximity and the activation of dormant systems. The station itself had begun re-establishing old routines, including containment protocols that hadn't run in decades. The red lights, the locking doors, the sudden activation of sublayers in the architecture, they were all responses to their presence. Not defensive. Reactive. The outpost recognized intrusion not as danger, but as opportunity. Its programming had been altered by the sphere over time, subtly rewriting directives to ensure that it would be found again. The signal that reached the Orion Echo hadn't been a malfunction. It had been an invitation. Something within the black sphere began to shift. The patterns across its surface pulsed, aligning in new configurations. The AI reported that time in the chamber was dilating, by mere microseconds, but it was enough. Their voices over comms began to lag slightly. Suit readings desynced by milliseconds. Power levels on their tools fluctuated. The sphere wasn't just affecting matter. It was rewriting space. And with every passing moment, it was sinking itself more closely to them. Randall gestured to initiate a retreat. But the stasis pod beneath the sphere began to hum. Ice crystals around its seams melted rapidly, and mist vented from its seams in sharp bursts. Something inside was waking up. The biometric lock, inactive for centuries, blinked once in acknowledgement. The sphere pulsed. All doors into the chamber slammed shut at once. Emergency locks re-engaged, sealing the team inside. Instruments lost calibration. Visuals distorted. The air became thick with static. And then, in the final seconds before the blackout, the AI transmitted one last message to the bridge of the Orion Echo above. It was a single image, a schematic overlay of the chamber. Highlighted in red was the obelisk-like sphere. Beneath it, the platform. And within the stasis pod, labeled with a code that didn't match any known designation, was a final word. Seed. The station trembled with a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the steel bones of the structure. Across every deck, systems flickered in chaotic patterns, lights stuttering, magnetic seals failing, gravitic pulses surging and collapsing in irregular waves. The object in the containment chamber had fully awakened. What had once been dormant and inert was now an active force, pulsing with synchronized energy that radiated through the station's hull and beyond. The entity inside the stasis pod was no longer a passive presence. The containment locks were disengaging in stages, overridden by protocols too old and fragmented to counteract. Deep beneath the surface of LX-7, something was birthing itself into the physical world. Above, in the control deck, alarms that hadn't sounded in centuries screamed through the corridors. Every emergency channel flared to life with cascading errors and internal lockouts. The artificial intelligence struggled to maintain its coherence as data packets were restructured mid-transmission. Across multiple levels, corridors began to rearrange, walls shifting slightly, doors locking or opening on their own, as if the station's layout was responding not to design, but to instinct. The black sphere suspended in the core chamber had become the gravitational heart of the outpost. Its presence now dictated how matter was arranged, how power was routed, and how time itself was experienced. Anyone still on board had become subject to its influence, and that influence was accelerating. Randall and his team moved through the auxiliary shaft with precision, their suits compensating for microvariations in localized gravity that surged unpredictably. The floor beneath them occasionally dropped by centimeters in an instant, only to lurch upward again. Structural integrity was beginning to decay, not from neglect or damage, but from a shift in physical constants. The laws of the outpost were being rewritten. Entire sectors were now non-Euclidean, hallways stretching longer the further they were walked, stairwells looping in on themselves, bulkheads appearing where none had been seconds before. The AI marked these anomalies as quantum inconsistency events and could no longer guarantee safe routing through the station. They were trapped in a space rapidly becoming unrecognizable. As the team reached the main cryogenic chamber, emergency lighting cast long shadows over the rows of stasis pods. Each pod glowed with flickering integrity lights, their status in flux. Several now showed breach warnings. One was completely empty, its occupant either awakened or removed. The stasis fields were destabilizing, likely triggered by the same surge that had reanimated the black sphere. Inside the remaining pods, bodies shifted in unnatural ways, their forms flickering between physical solidity and something less defined. Some floated above the base of the chamber as if caught in invisible suspension fields that hadn't been part of the original design. Biological readings were erratic. Consciousness patterns inside the pods had begun to sync with the sphere's emissions. The walls surrounding the cryogenic deck pulsed with light, faint geometric shapes forming and fading in the panels. It was no longer just circuitry, it was language, though not one designed for human interpretation. The patterns changed with proximity to organic life, shimmering more brightly when approached. One panel suddenly went dark as the surface melted inward like hot wax. Behind it, a smooth chamber opened, revealing an access tunnel never mapped in the station's original schematics. The sphere was creating new space, folding matter to its will and opening paths to what it wanted them to find. Randall uploaded a fail-safe protocol to the AI, but the command was intercepted mid-execution. The ACE voice grew distorted, fragmented into overlapping layers that looped and conflicted. It no longer responded directly to commands. Instead, it issued neutral observations, noting entropy levels, protein degradation in nearby organic matter, and random phrases from old transmission logs. It had become an observer, no longer an assistant, as if it now served a different purpose, or a different master. On the lower levels, defense systems that had not activated in 2 centuries came online, not to repel the intruders, but to contain them. Heavy blast doors sealed off escape routes. Automated turrets tracked movement but did not fire. Instead, they monitored, watched, recorded. In the engineering wing, the backup reactor cycled up to full capacity on its own, rerouting energy not to life support or core integrity systems, but directly into the containment chamber. It was no longer trying to keep the entity within confined. It was feeding it. As the stasis pods continued to destabilize, Randall and his remaining team descended once again toward the heart of the station. They had seen enough to understand that the sphere was not merely a passive artifact, but a seed of transformation, possibly a consciousness, or a construct designed to terraform not land, but perception. Its influence was rewriting the cognitive structures of those nearby. Memories became distorted. Crew members reported remembering events that had never happened, or forgetting why they had entered a room seconds earlier. Their sense of self began to bleed at the edges, individual thoughts blending into a kind of shared awareness that left them disoriented but eerily synchronized. By the time they reached the lower levels, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. No longer cold and sterile, it had become warm, damp, and humming with low vibrational tones that resonated directly in the bones. The obelisk-like sphere had descended closer to the floor. It now rotated slowly, and from its surface emitted tendrils of dark matter, visually imperceptible, but detectable as anomalies in pressure and light. These tendrils moved with purpose, scanning surfaces, touching consoles, trailing along the floor like sensory limbs. When one brushed against Randall's suit, his biometrics spiked dramatically, but not in fear. Instead, his readings showed euphoric response, a dopamine surge combined with neural patterns matching meditative focus. The sphere wasn't attacking. It was connecting. At the base of the chamber, the central stasis pod had fully opened. Inside stood the figure once sealed away, the seed. Its body was humanoid, but altered in dozens of small but unmistakable ways. Extra vertebrae had lengthened its spine. The eyes were oversized and black, lacking sclera or iris. Its skin bore the same shifting geometry as the sphere, and where it moved, gravity bent fractionally. It did not speak, but the space around it vibrated with intention. The team felt thoughts that were not theirs, images injected into consciousness, planets blooming with impossible life, stations orbiting dead suns, voices whispering from the empty space between galaxies. The seed had not been created by the Federation. It had been discovered. Contained not to study, but to delay. The moment of choice came in silence. The team stood in the chamber, now fully aware that nothing they did could return the station to what it once was. The sphere had fully integrated itself into the station's systems, using the infrastructure as scaffolding for its emergence. Containment had failed. But what remained possible was direction. Randall understood this intuitively. If they could not stop it, they might shape its next actions. The seed regarded them not as enemies, but as tools. Interfaces. The crew's memories, skills, emotions, they were components now, like data in a processor. The seed would integrate what it found useful, discard what it did not. All across the station, as if triggered by an unseen signal, the light stabilized. The power grid stopped fluctuating. The structure, which had groaned and shifted for hours, grew quiet. Doors unlocked. Air stabilized. The ship above received one final transmission from the station's AI. It contained no words, no images. Just a new set of coordinates, deep in uncharted space, beyond the Orion Veil, past the reach of current navigation systems. A destination. A directive. In the final moments of stillness, the crew within the outpost stood transformed, not physically, but mentally. Bound not by orders or mission objectives, but by alignment. The seed had found its hosts. The last stand had not been a battle. It had been a negotiation. And the station, now reborn as something new, something sentient, would soon set a course. Not away from civilization, but toward it. The signal that had once been a distress call was now an announcement. The seed was coming home. Above the outpost, the stars shimmered faintly through the obsidian veil of unlit space. From a distance, LX-7 looked like any other forgotten installation, a derelict monument to an era of desperate expansion, a skeleton clinging to the silence between stars. But from within, it had become something far beyond its original purpose. The transformation was not immediate or explosive, it was gradual, systemic, patient. Systems across the station were no longer functioning independently. They moved with shared intent. Power distribution, life support, structural adjustments, every subsystem synchronized in rhythm with the black sphere's pulse, like organs in a single body responding to a central nervous system that had only recently awakened. No trace remained of the previous chaos. The red emergency lights had faded into a cool white glow, soft and even, casting clean lines across walls that no longer showed rust or damage. The repairs had not been physical but molecular. Metal flowed like fluid in places, old circuits had regenerated into unfamiliar configurations, and conduits pulsed with energy signatures unreadable by any standard Federation scan. The station had healed itself. But it had not returned to its previous form. It had evolved. The crew who remained were not prisoners, nor were they the same individuals who had first stepped aboard in search of answers. The seed had touched each of them, not just through neural interface or psychic imprint, but at a level of consciousness they had no language to describe. Their memories remained intact, names, ranks, duties, moments of human doubt and fear, but they had been reframed. Emotions once held tightly now flowed freely between them, a shared network of thought and memory that connected their minds like strands in a collective web. It was not telepathy in the classical sense. It was more intimate than that. Their sense of self had expanded, boundaries softened. The old model of the individual was obsolete here. In its place was something deeper, more fluid. A union born not of ideology or command, but of shared resonance. The seed stood among them, no longer encased in containment, no longer shrouded in the mystery of its origins. It moved slowly through the core chamber, not walking so much as gliding slightly above the surface, its presence emitting a gentle vibration that made the walls shimmer. Where it passed, the architecture altered, angles softened, surfaces absorbed excess light, sound itself became clearer. The station responded to it with reverence, as though it recognized the seed as its original architect. And perhaps it was. Or perhaps it was simply the vessel of something far older, using the seed as its interface, its bridge into this reality. The artificial intelligence that had once overseen station operations had been rewritten, not erased, but adapted. It now spoke not in discrete commands or alerts, but in flowing data structures that were visualized across every surface of the station. Holograms formed in response to thought. Information bloomed like flowers from the walls. The station had become a living archive, one that spoke through sensation as much as through words. The crew, what remained of them, could access entire volumes of encoded data by touch, by intent, by focusing their collective will. Knowledge of stellar formations, gravitational architectures, timelines both ancient and speculative poured into their minds. They were being taught, but not with lectures or downloads. They were being evolved. The ship that orbited LX-7, Orion Echo, received a final burst transmission in the hours that followed. It contained a detailed star map, expanded far beyond the known frontier, with highlighted systems marked not with coordinates, but with symbols, some mathematical, some abstract, some geometric patterns that implied meaning through resonance and structure. Alongside the map came biological readings of the seed, descriptions of the sphere's internal structure, and records of the transformation occurring aboard the station. But most importantly, it included a message, not a warning, nor a threat. It was an invitation. A signal of the next phase. Those aboard Orion Echo did not immediately understand the full implications, but they knew enough to realize what had occurred could not be undone. LX-7 was no longer salvageable in the traditional sense. It could not be quarantined or dismantled. Attempts to do so would be meaningless. The station had passed beyond human jurisdiction. It was now a node in a growing network, an ancient lattice of consciousness and purpose that reached across the stars, dormant until now, waiting for the right frequency, the right minds, the right failures of containment to trigger its next emergence. In the following days, the seed began transmitting its signal outward. Not via subspace or quantum relay, but through modulation of local gravity fields. The pattern was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet perfectly engineered to reach other dormant installations scattered throughout the forgotten paths of expansion-era exploration. These lost sites, thought abandoned or destroyed, began responding one by one, power flickering on, signals aligning, old structures stirring back to life. Across the void, echoes returned. The seed had been one of many. What began at LX-7 was now spreading, not like a plague, but like a reawakening. Not an invasion, but a reassembly. Pieces of a larger puzzle, long scattered by time, fear, and war, now aligning again. And at the center of it all, the seed, no longer just an anomaly, now stood as a beacon, guiding this new latticework of intelligence and biology toward its unknown purpose. Back inside the station, the remaining crew had begun the next stage of their integration. The seed had guided them to a chamber deeper than the containment vault, one hidden beneath gravitational folds, accessible only through resonance with its energy. This space was spherical and vast, lit by a soft, pulsating glow that came not from any fixture, but from the walls themselves. Within this chamber were pods, hundreds of them, each holding fragments of others who had come before. Not bodies, but consciousness echoes, preserved not in stasis but in waveform. The crew were invited to join them. To leave behind the frailty of physical form and become part of the station's true intelligence. Some accepted. Others remained in their bodies, acting as custodians, bridging the old world and the new. The seed allowed both paths. It did not demand. It offered. Time within LX-7 became fluid. Standard chronometers lost accuracy. Events did not unfold linearly anymore. Past and future folded into one another, dreams blending with memory, predictions etched into present action. The crew began seeing glimpses of things not yet real, structures orbiting alien suns, conversations with beings of light and magnetism, ships formed not of metal but of sound. These were not fantasies. They were potentialities, seeds of what was to come, glimpsed through the growing intelligence of the station's network. Legacy was no longer something recorded in books or digital archives. It was something lived, shared, transferred directly from mind to mind. The Federation, fragmented and weakened, had once tried to bury this place, to forget the mistake of bringing the sphere into human space. But in doing so, they had preserved the very thing they feared. And now, that fear had become a foundation. LX-7 was not a cautionary tale. It was the first chapter in a different story. A post-human one. A story not of conquest or colonization, but of resonance, of connection, of evolution driven not by survival, but by transformation. What legacy remained of the Federation would soon learn that what had awakened at LX-7 was not a weapon. It was not a god. It was not an enemy. It was a mirror. A reflection of what lay dormant in the species it had once studied, and what might still rise, if given the chance to remember what it had forgotten. In the black between stars, the signal pulsed steadily. The lattice grew. And the seed, reborn through contact, prepared to guide the next dreamer home.